The fog lay low and thick that morning, blanketing the redwoods in a pale hush. Every sound, the creak of branches, the occasional drop of water from pine needles, felt amplified, suspended in a world between sleep and waking. Beneath that stillness, something stirred, a whimper, ragged, barely there. Charlie Walker's cabin sat at the edge of Trinity Forest where the trees grew oldest and the trail maps turned vague. He hadn't heard the sound from inside, but Boone had. The old retriever's ears twitched, his head lifting from the woven rug, before he slowly stood and padded toward the door, his joints protesting. Outside, the air carried a chill that kissed Charlie's skin, even beneath his flannel. But Boone moved with uncharacteristic purpose, nose close to the damp ground, tail stiff with concentration. Charlie followed, without question. Down the slope, past a stand of cedar, Boone stopped, just short of the blackberry thicket. Something was there. Something small, breathing, curled into the brush, barely visible beneath broken twigs and half-frozen moss. Was a kitten. Not the kind anyone brought in from a shelter. Wild, short tail, spotted fur, tufted ears still twitching from fear. But what stunned Charlie wasn't just the bobcat's presence. It was the way Boone, without hesitation, lay beside it, his old body easing down into the dirt, forming a shelter with his warmth. The kitten didn't run. It pressed against Boone's side, chest rising and falling rapidly, its tiny body shaking. Boone licked its head once, slow, deliberate, and the kitten chirped, a sound like a question, like trust. Charlie dropped to one knee, his breath catching. Something had happened here, but first, he had to get them both home. Charlie Walker had lived alone for nearly 2 years, not counting Boone. The cabin, pine-walled, one-story, tucked deep into a fold of Trinity National Forest, had once been filled with sound. Marjorie's humming from the kitchen, the soft thump of her slippers, the scrape of a wooden spoon in her favorite red pot. But since the cancer took her, silence had made a slow home of its own. Boone filled some of that emptiness, loyal, quiet, a golden retriever with eyes too wise for his age, and a gait that had grown heavier over the past winter. He was Charlie's shadow, his reason for morning walks, his warmth at night when dreams pressed in too close. Most days began with the kettle whistling just before sunrise, a splash of cream in Charlie's chipped mug. He'd sit on the porch while the world came awake, birds stirring, wind shifting through the trees like a whispered name. Boone would nudge the screen door open and rest his chin on Charlie's knee. Always the same ritual. But there was something different about that spring, a kind of stillness that clung even after the fog burned off. Charlie had noticed Boone slowing, not just tiredness, but a deep kind of weariness, as if something in his bones knew time was folding in. Still, the dog never missed a walk. They'd wander trails with no names, Boone sniffing every tree, like a cartographer mapping the world with his nose. Charlie carried his old camera, though the photos were more habit than art now. Moss on bark, a hawk lifting into silence, Boone's paws in a muddy stream. They didn't speak, not aloud, but a rhythm lived between them, one built over years of unspoken presence. And that morning, when Boone veered off the trail, Charlie followed. He didn't question it. He didn't need to. The night before had been strange. Boone had stood at the door long after dark, ears up, nose twitching towards something unseen. Charlie had dismissed it, probably a deer, or maybe one of the foxes that sometimes darted through the meadow. But Boone hadn't settled, not really. He lay beside the fireplace, eyes fixed on the door, until sleep finally claimed him. Now, in the hush of morning, Boone's urgency was unmistakable. Charlie had to duck under low-hanging branches, boots crunching over damp needles. The path narrowed, sloping down into an overgrown hollow. That's where Boone stopped, his tail low, ears soft with caution. The kitten was barely visible. A fleck of shadow, fur matted, ears twitching, one leg curled awkwardly beneath it. And yet, it didn't hiss, didn't bolt. It looked up at Boone, and something in its eyes, green flecked with gold, seemed unguarded. Then Boone did something Charlie would never forget. He lay down beside it. Not just near, beside, as if to say, "You're not alone now." Charlie crouched, unsure if the kitten was too injured to run or too trusting to care. He reached slowly, gloved hands cradling the fragile body, while Boone rose to stand protectively. The kitten didn't resist, it simply leaned into Boone's chest, and Charlie, for the first time in a long while, felt something sharp and bright rise in his chest. Hope, uninvited, but insistent. At home, Charlie lined a basket with an old flannel and placed it near the hearth. The kitten curled immediately beside Boone, who stretched out like a sentinel. The fire popped softly. Outside, the fog thinned to threads. Charlie stood over them, one hand on the doorway, unsure what he'd just brought home. A wild thing, a broken thing, but not feral, not with Boone's head resting gently over it like a promise. He should have been afraid. He wasn't. Instead, he whispered, "You found him, didn't you, old boy?" Boone thumped his tail once, very faint. The kitten blinked up at him. Not wild, not tame, just there, present. The world didn't feel quite so quiet anymore. It should have just been another walk. That's what Charlie kept telling himself, hours later, as he replayed the moment again and again. Boone had led him deeper than usual that morning, through stands of fir and alder where the light dappled soft and green. Charlie had called out twice, expecting Boone to circle back. But the older dog hadn't so much as turned his head. Instead, he pushed forward, slower now, focused. When Boone finally stopped, they stood on the edge of a narrow ravine. Hidden beneath fallen branches and last year's leaves, the air smelled of damp soil and pine resin. Charlie crouched beside him, brow furrowed, gaze scanning the brush. Then he heard it, a sound like nothing else he'd known, a keening chirrup, broken and thin. It cut through the quiet like a thread pulled too tight. He pushed the undergrowth aside with gloved hands. And there, folded into a hollow at the base of a cedar stump, was the kitten. Charlie's first instinct was that it had been abandoned, but the second, the deeper instinct, the one he trusted, said no, this kitten hadn't been left behind. It had been waiting. Its spotted coat was streaked with mud. One leg, front left, was angled strangely, not broken, but bruised. A twig was tangled in its fur. But what struck Charlie most was the stillness, not frozen with fear, not wild with panic, just watching. The kitten's eyes met Boone's first, then Charlie's, and something passed between them that had no name. Charlie reached for it, slowly, carefully. He didn't expect it to allow the contact, but it didn't pull away. Boone leaned forward gently and licked the kitten's cheek. The kitten chirped again, a soft, uncertain sound, like a question answered. Charlie's throat tightened. "Well," he murmured, "guess that's that." He eased the kitten into his coat, wrapping it in his scarf. Boone walked beside him all the way home, glancing back every few steps. The cabin was warmer than the forest, but still smelled of wood smoke and pine. Charlie laid the kitten on a folded fleece blanket beside the hearth. Boone dropped down nearby with a soft grunt, his back brushing the basket of firewood. The kitten chirped once. Then, without hesitation, crawled toward Boone and curled beneath his neck, disappearing beneath his fur. Charlie stood in the doorway, holding a steaming mug he'd forgotten to sip from. Watching a dog and a bobcat breathe in perfect rhythm, he tried to convince himself that it was temporary, just an animal in need of shelter. But deep down, he felt it. Boone hadn't just found the kitten, he'd chosen it, and the kitten, somehow, had done the same. That evening, Charlie sat cross-legged near the fire, watching the rise and fall of Boone's chest. The kitten stirred occasionally, stretching one paw, kneading Boone's side in tiny circles. Charlie leaned in, holding a shallow dish of water. The kitten blinked up at him, weary but alert. "Drink?" he asked, setting the dish down. To his surprise, the kitten stepped forward, limping slightly, and began lapping. Its tail flicked once, brushing Boone's paw. Boone responded with a sleepy sigh, barely opening one eye. "Not exactly what I expected from retirement," Charlie muttered, half to himself. The kitten paused its drinking, glanced up, and chirped again. Charlie smiled. He thought of Marjorie. How she used to say that lost things had a way of finding the right people, that maybe the forest gave back sometimes, not what you were looking for, but what you didn't know you needed. He reached out, fingers grazing the kitten's spine. It didn't flinch. "You're staying, aren't you?" he whispered. "At least, for a while." Behind him, the kettle began to sing. The kitten wouldn't eat unless Boone was nearby. Charlie noticed it the second day. He'd placed a small dish of warm chicken and broth just beside the basket. The kitten sniffed it, then chirped, a small, wavering sound, before padding away. But as soon as Boone settled down beside the dish, the kitten crept forward, crouched low, and began to eat, side pressed against Boone's paw. It was more than dependency, it was reverence. Charlie named the kitten Ash for his smoky coat, the dark rings like fire shadows trailing down his spine. The name fit, somehow, a flicker of something wild that hadn't yet gone out. Ash was still limping, but the swelling had gone down. Charlie wrapped the injured paw with warm cloths, his hands gentle, his voice even. He never spoke too much, just enough for the kitten to recognize the shape of safety in his tone. At night, Ash slept curled against Boone's chest, a barely visible comma of breath and fur. Boone would shift sometimes, muzzle resting on Ash's head. If Boone stirred in his sleep with a sigh or soft growl, Ash would chirp low and still and tuck himself tighter, as if anchoring him. Charlie couldn't look at it too long, not without something catching in his chest, because Boone was changing. He was still loyal, still present. But his steps were slower now. He hesitated before standing. He slept longer, deeper. The vet had warned Charlie months ago that the decline would come fast once it started. And Charlie had nodded, tucked the words away like a bitter seed in his pocket. But this bond that was blooming, it softened the edges. Boone had found something to care for, and in return, Ash had given him purpose. Ash began exploring the house in short, cautious circuits. He moved like smoke, silent, unsure, but curious. Charlie watched him one afternoon climb halfway onto the arm of Marjorie's old reading chair. Ash sniffed the knit shawl draped over the back, pawed it once, then leapt away, like the fabric had whispered a secret he wasn't ready to hear. Charlie didn't say anything. He just folded the shawl neatly and placed it in a basket near the fireplace. That same night, Ash returned to the chair, climbed all the way up, and fell asleep there, curled into a ball no bigger than a curled glove. Feeding time became its own ritual. Boone, in his old, patient way, would lie on the mat near the kitchen door, Ash would wait, until Charlie placed the food down, glance once at Boone as if for permission, then eat in swift, grateful bites. Charlie noticed how Ash mimicked Boone's habits, drinking from the same corner of the bowl, walking in measured steps just behind him, even yawning after Boone did. And Boone, he let it happen. No growls, no stiff posture, just quiet acceptance. It reminded Charlie of how Boone used to behave around Marjorie in her final weeks, gentle, protective, always listening. Boone had a gift for presence, for sitting close without overwhelming. Ash, it seemed, had the same. One morning, Charlie opened the back door to let in the cool breeze and forgot to close it. He'd just poured his coffee when he realized. The kitten was gone. Panic flickered through his chest like a spark, sharp and immediate. He checked the basket. Empty. Boone was standing near the door, tail high, alert. He didn't bark, he didn't move. Charlie stepped out onto the porch, mug shaking in his hand. "Ash," he called softly. Nothing, just wind through cedar. Then a chirp, faint, high-pitched. Ash was on the second step, staring at the open forest beyond the garden. But he didn't run. He looked back at Charlie, then at Boone. His body trembled with indecision. Charlie didn't say a word. Boone stepped down, slow, his bones protesting. He nuzzled Ash once, gently guiding him back inside. Charlie closed the door. His knees felt weak. Ash had looked at the trees. But he'd chosen the dog. The days blurred into one another in the most beautiful way. Boone rested more. Ash played more. They had a favorite spot beneath the window in the living room, where the sun made a golden square across the rug. Boone would lie flat on his side. Ash would stretch across Boone's back, tail flicking rhythmically. Sometimes Charlie would look up from his desk and find them both asleep, breathing in time. He'd quietly reach for his camera, hands trembling slightly, and take the shot. He never shared the pictures, not online, not with friends. They were his, just like this time was. One evening, thunder rolled low in the distance. Ash flinched. Boone didn't move. He was too tired now, too still. Ash approached him hesitantly, touched Boone's nose with his own. When Boone didn't respond, Ash let out a cry. Long, thin, trembling. Then he climbed onto Boone's side, curled up, and stayed there, as if he could warm Boone back to waking. Charlie sat on the floor beside them, legs crossed, one hand resting gently on Boone's shoulder. "You're teaching him," he whispered, voice cracking. "You're showing him how to be gentle in a world that's never been gentle to him." Outside, the storm passed. The air smelled of rain and pine. Inside, a dog and a bobcat dreamed in the light of the dying fire. It started with Boone refusing breakfast. He sniffed the bowl Charlie placed near the porch door, then turned away, walking slowly toward the rug in front of the hearth. Ash followed, chirping once, circling Boone's legs with concern. But Boone only lay down with a low sigh, his eyes glassy, breath shallow. Charlie stood motionless in the kitchen, a spoon in one hand, unsure why this moment felt different. Boone had skipped meals before, but this wasn't forgetfulness or fatigue. This was goodbye. He knelt beside Boone, fingers tracing the familiar fur, now flecked with white. Boone looked up at him, tired, but still present, still Boone. Ash curled close, tucking himself under Boone's chin, as if trying to hold something in place with the weight of his own small body. Charlie called the vet, quietly, without much explanation. The voice on the other end softened when it recognized his name. They said they'd come to the house. Charlie hung up the phone and stared at the wall. He didn't cry. Not yet. Boone's last walk was not a walk at all. Charlie wrapped him gently in Marjorie's shawl, the one that smelled faintly of cedar and thyme, and carried him out to the garden behind the cabin. Ash padded behind them, silent. Charlie set Boone down on the soft moss beneath the dogwood tree. The sky was pale blue above, birdsong threading the still air, like memory. Ash climbed into the shawl beside Boone and stayed there. The vet arrived an hour later, parked quietly, spoke in a voice made for sacred things. She knelt beside Boone, stroked his side, and whispered something only Boone could hear. Charlie didn't watch. He stared at the distant line of the forest, his hands trembling in his pockets. It was over quickly. Boone didn't stir, didn't cry. Ash did. The sound tore through the garden, raw and ragged, a single note of grief, then silence. That night, Ash was gone. Charlie left the door ajar, unsure whether he'd meant to. Maybe part of him had known. Maybe part of him had already started letting go. He sat up until after midnight. The house too quiet, the fire too dim. Every creak sounded like a footstep, every breath a memory. When morning came and Ash was still gone, Charlie walked the perimeter of the property. He called softly. No answer, no chirps, no paw prints in the damp earth. The silence was familiar now. He made coffee, poured 2 mugs by accident, then stood at the sink until one went cold. Ash didn't come back that day, or the next. 3 days passed before the first sound returned, a soft scrape at the porch door just after dusk. Charlie had nearly dozed off in his chair when he heard it, a hush against the wood, almost too soft to notice. He opened the door slowly. Ash stood there, eyes wide, fur dusted with pine needles. But he wasn't alone. 2 kittens, smaller than Ash, thinner, more ragged, stood huddled behind him. They looked half-starved, trembling from the cold. Ash chirped once, low and firm, then stepped aside. Charlie froze, then opened the door wider. The siblings didn't run. They followed Ash inside, moving like shadows. Ash walked straight to the hearth and curled into the basket. The smaller kittens followed, curling around him like ivy to a tree. Charlie dropped to one knee, voice thick in his throat. "You went to find them," he whispered. Ash blinked at him, tail flicking once. He had waited, grieved, and then done. What Boone had taught him to do. He had found someone to protect, to bring home. Charlie closed the door behind them and turned on the kettle. 3 bowls this time, and one new name already in his heart. Spring melted quietly into summer. The forest bloomed in new greens, bees lingered longer at the windows, and the dogwood tree under which Boone now rested blossomed in soft pinks like petals of memory. Charlie moved through his days with gentler hands. He built the enclosure by hand, 6 feet high, cedar-planked, with open views of the forest and a shaded, warming hut. It sat just beyond the garden, nestled beneath a stand of birch. Not a cage, a haven. Ash and his siblings, Charlie named them Birch and Clover, spent mornings sprawled in the patchy sunlight, afternoons curled into one another like tangled yarn. They were still wild, but not alone. Never that again. Ash remained the sentinel. Though his paw had healed, he walked with a slight limp. He moved with quiet purpose now. Ears alert, always between his siblings and the edge of the woods. Charlie saw Boone in him. It wasn't in the way Ash walked, or even how he waited at the door each morning for Charlie to appear. It was in how he stayed near, never pressing too close, offering safety through presence. Just like Boone had. The morning after Ash returned, Charlie had found something that undid him completely. Boone's collar, left at the base of the tree, gently dusted with pine needles. Ash must have carried it there, A gesture, a memory, a promise kept. On warm evenings, Charlie would sit by the enclosure with his coffee. Sometimes he'd speak aloud, knowing the bobcats didn't understand the words, but sensing that maybe the sound meant something. Ash would always listen. One evening, as the sun slipped low and everything turned gold, Charlie noticed Ash sitting apart near the corner post, eyes fixed on something in the distance. A deer? A shadow? Charlie stepped closer. Ash turned his head, met his gaze, and slowly reached out one paw, pressing it against the mesh of the enclosure, right where Charlie's hand rested. It wasn't a plea, it wasn't a question, it was a presence, a connection. Charlie swallowed the knot in his throat. "I see you," he whispered, "and I remember him too." Ash blinked once, then returned to his siblings. When the call came from the Wildlife Center, an offer to take Birch and Clover into the full rehabilitation program, Charlie hesitated. They were strong now, ready. Ash wasn't. He wasn't injured. Not anymore. But his bond was different. So Charlie asked if Ash could stay just a little longer. The director agreed, on the condition that Charlie continue the enclosure and allow periodic check-ins. "He may never be wild again," she warned. Charlie only nodded. "He's not tame either," she smiled. "Some of them live between." The day Birch and Clover were picked up, Ash followed their carrier to the truck. He circled it once, chirped once, then returned to the porch. Charlie watched him from the steps. "That was your family," he said quietly. Ash climbed up beside him, tail curling neatly around his paws. "They'll be okay." The bobcat leaned against his leg for just a breath. Charlie reached down, hand to fur, wild to human, still, here, together. The seasons turned like pages in a book you didn't want to end. Ash stayed. He grew leaner, stronger, no longer the limping kitten Charlie had first cradled in his arms. His coat darkened, losing some of its smoky softness. But his eyes stayed wild and bright, flecked with the same green gold that Charlie had learned to trust. The enclosure became a sanctuary not just for Ash, but for Charlie too. He added branches, stones, old logs for climbing. Built a small shelter that mirrored the cabin's roofline, planted native grasses along the outer edge. Each morning, Ash would greet him with a slow blink from his perch, tail curling over his paws like a ribbon of smoke. Charlie still kept Boone's collar on the porch post. It hung beside a hand-carved plaque, rough-hewn from cedar. Some bonds never end. On quiet mornings, he'd sit beside the garden and listen. Coffee in one hand, stillness in the other. Sometimes, he'd speak aloud. Not to fill the silence, but to give it shape. "There's a rhythm to this place now," he'd say softly. "And you helped stitch it together." Ash would glance up from his sunlit rock, as if acknowledging the weight of those words. One late summer evening, Charlie walked the old trail alone. He passed the spot where Boone had first found Ash, where the thicket still grew, unchanged. A breeze stirred the ferns. Somewhere overhead, a hawk called once, then was silent. Charlie closed his eyes. He could still feel Boone at his side, the warmth of him, the unspoken language of a dog who had given his last months not to comfort, but to protect something fragile and unnamed. Ash hadn't replaced that presence. He had honored it. He had become its echo. That night, Charlie left the door open. Ash didn't go far, just sat on the porch rail, eyes reflecting the moonlight. The forest hummed beyond them, alive with cicadas, wind, and stories the trees would never tell. Charlie watched the silhouette of the bobcat, and in the quiet he whispered, "You brought him back to me, in the way you stay, in the way you watch." Ash didn't move, but his tail thudded once, gently, against the railing. Charlie smiled, a deep, worn smile, the kind made not of happiness, but of presence, of peace. If this story touched your heart, stay close. Here on Paw Prints and Stories, we believe some bonds never end. Some stories don't need words, just presence.